Hi, I'm Dr. David Day of Samurai Digital Security, and this is 404 Cybersecurity Not Found, tearing cybersecurity a new arse since 2015.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode. I'm joined today with Dr. David Day, as always. So today we're going to talk about, well, Dave, what we're going to talk about today.
I thought we could do and have a little conversation about the cybersecurity landscape and talk about, exactly what is cybersecurity in a broader context.
The topic as a whole is just incredibly broad and incredibly deep. How can we summarize that?
There's ways of sort of breaking it down into chunks, if you like, to simplify it. It is a very broad subject. There's ways of categorizing it to make it easier. So cybersecurity itself, when I was teaching this to first year students at university, I'd start with defining confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And if you've studied cybersecurity at all, then you would have come across those three terms as being the sort of lesson one um, in your cybersecurity studies. But it's worth going through again, right? And it's worth being clear on what they mean, because sometimes I go back and I revisit this stuff, and the more you learn and the more you understand, sometimes when you take a step backwards and look at it again, you see it in a different light and you have a different view on it and a different take on it, because there was gaps in your knowledge before which have now been filled. So when we're talking about the confidentiality of data, we're talking about a situation where if somebody sends you information, right, that it's authentic, right? That it's been properly authenticated, and the person that is sending you that data, or the person that is using a particular system, is the person that's supposed to be doing that, not somebody doing it fraudulently, not a hacker, or not somebody who's impersonating you. So that's what confidentiality is.
So aligning the sender and the receiver of the data.
Yes, yeah. I mean, when you talk about authentication and confidentiality, those are the two things that they're two words that tie together. Authentication is the mechanism for creating confidentiality. So obviously, with authentication, we're talking about passwords, multi-factor authentication, the use of biometrics. There's various talking points around each of those, and I'm not going to dwell on it for too long, but I will just touch on it quickly. So obviously, the core method of ensuring confidentiality is passwords. That's ubiquitous, right? Seems to exist everywhere. But passwords have their issues. They're forgettable, particularly when they're guessable if we're not careful. So the guessable and forgettable thing kind of go together, because the more guessable something is, the less forgettable it tends to be. But obviously it's weakened, isn't it, by if you think of something or attach it to yourself as a password, or date of births, parents' names, children's names, pets' names, all of that. We've heard it all before, right? We know that's terrible to do. But then if we try to come away from that, we encourage people to come away from that, then we have the problems with them being then forgettable. We make them longer and more complex, and they become easier to forget. And there's a couple of ways around that which aren't perfect. And we talk about the use of passphrases now, don't we? And that's something actually I'm quite a fan of, or just stringing four or five words together, and including a bit of white space. I don't, I've read counter arguments to that, but I don't have any problems with it. White space, asterisk, space.
Well, obviously, the use of secure passwords is incredibly important, and layering that with multi-factor is also another way to secure it. But I'm interested in biometrics and the limitations of that with regards to confidentiality.
But I'm just going to touch on password managers before we go on to that, though, because if you're looking at that way of making your password more secure, then yeah, longer, make it longer is better than complex. And if you can find a way of remembering it by using numerous different words, great. Obviously, password managers and storing all of your passwords under one super secure strong password is is a good way to go as well, and that's something which I do, and many people do. And obviously, we've got some great ones now, which will just put the passwords in for you when you go onto the sites, etc. There's various arguments you can open up against that, but that's passwords is part of confidentiality. Um, you mentioned biometrics, Brad. Obviously, we've got multi-factor authentication as well. So your Authenticator apps, apps that send magic links and send SMS codes. And we've got another podcast on the downsides of SMS codes. So please look that one up. Not a smart idea to use SMS for MFA. I'm not a big fan of magic links either, because they're just links that are sent to you in your email that you click and then log in. Authenticator apps are my particular favorites, things like Google Authenticator or Microsoft Authenticator, where, it gives you a series of numbers for each app, and those numbers rotate periodically. And those numbers appear on your phone, and your app is dedicated on your phone, and your phone is secure, hopefully, if you've secured your phone. So password managers and authenticator apps. There you go. They're the two takeaways from that conversation. Biometrics is an interesting one. Again, we're on confidentiality here, proving you are who you say you are. Numerous different ways, isn't there, of authenticating with biometrics: voice, face, fingerprint, eye, iris, retina within the eye that are used sometimes. And when these first started coming out, I think we all thought, well, that's going to be it, right? That's going to be the end of passwords. And it hasn't been, and the reason why it hasn't been is because there's certain things passwords can do that the others can't. So we're still talking about data. If it's voice or it's face or it's fingerprint or it's eye, it's still data. And data can be forged and data can be stolen. I mean, if your password was compromised, Brad, if I told you your password was compromised, what would you do?
Go and change it.
Right. So if I told you that your retina data had been compromised and somebody got hold of that, what would you do?
Walk around with my eyes closed.
Right. Okay.
Nothing you can
So
do.
there's nothing you can do, right? It's the same with fingerprints. They're not easily changed. Face, okay, maybe you could have some plastic surgery. I don't know, possibly. And the same with voice, and with face and voice. Of course, we're in deep fake category now, can't we? Voices can be impersonated. People made lots of money from doing impersonations, and faces can be deep faked. And a lot of the apps, even the good apps, can be forged using photography and digital imagery, and fingerprints too can be forged. There was a group of students at, I forget which university it was now, that actually took fingerprints off a glass. People used a glass and they managed to create a wrap over for fingers, and 80% of the time it was successful, and this was taking prints off a glass. So it can be done. It can be forged. The iris ones tend to be it can be intrusive, because you've got to like put your eyes really close, and it's special apparatus that shines an infrared beam against the back of your eye to pick that out. But they're extremely accurate. But the hardware is actually getting an awful lot cheaper now, but it's still more costly than the others. And we have iris, which uses the sort of the shape of the outside of the coloured part of the eye to make a decision about whether you are who you say you are. But the iris problem, of course, is the fact that you can still use a photo. There's still, if you have a really good photo, you can still, or digital imagery, it is still possible to spoof it. So, the most spoof-free is the retina. Unfortunately, those certain diseases can affect that in terms of how well that works as well. So there's no perfects here. And we've already talked about the fact that you can't change them, and, you're limited by the technology. And it's these kind of reasons for why passwords are still ubiquitous. You don't need any special hardware for a password. If it gets compromised, it's a relatively easy fix. And I think that's why they're still about. And so that's just giving you some idea of the issues that we have. I think what confidentiality is and what some of the issues are surrounding it. So just puts you in a position where you can hold a conversation if you need to around confidentiality.
Yeah, I was going to ask about integrity and what that means.
you want to have some proof, or at least some assurance, that a communication hasn't been intercepted or altered on its route from source to destination and vice versa. So between Alice and Bob and Alice, nobody's sitting in the middle, like Fred, for instance, listening in to all of Alice and Bob's plans. Alice and Bob talk a lot, don't they? Have you noticed that? They have an awful lot of, in the cybersecurity industry especially, they have an awful lot of conversations. Yeah, so the idea there is to try and prevent people from, being able to listen in. So what we're talking about is the prevention of interception and modification of messages, but also listening to those messages and too. So the whole, man in the middle attacks, as they call them, trying to prevent those. And whereas with authentication and confidentiality, we talk about metrics for proving who you are, like passwords. The go-to method of preventing people listening in or intercepting information is encryption. And so and we have two forms, not two forms of encryption, but two forms of preventing integrity compromise, and one's encryption, the other is hashing. So encryption's a reversible method. You have a plain text, then you have a cipher, which modifies the plain text, and then you end up with ciphertext, which is the modified text, which is unreadable unless you have the cipher, the key to decrypt it. And so there's also the question of what we do with the data at rest too. And data should be encrypted at rest or hashed at rest. Most cybersecurity people are quite strong advocates of hashing. There is ways around it, and I'll talk about that in a second. But generally speaking, if you steal a hashed password, and that's basically where you take a clear text password and you apply a mathematical equation to calculation to it, and then you end up with a string of nonsense at the other side. And you cannot get that string of nonsense to go back to the original password. You can't apply the same piece of maths and get it to go back again. It's impossible. But obviously, if you supply the same password again, it will produce the same nonsense. And then you can compare the two nonsenses. Yes, they match. Right. Okay. It's the password's confirmed. And obviously, the beauty of that is if data is stored in hashes, and nobody knows what the password is. It can't be, if it's stolen, it's useless. It isn't quite that simple, and I'll come to that in a second. Whereas, with encryption, if somebody gets the encryption key, then you're in bother. So hashing is nice because hashing means that even the company that's storing the hash doesn't know what you chose for your password and can't find out. That's not entirely true, and the chink to the truth in that is something called rainbow tables. So if you take, so let's say you take every dictionary word and run it through a hashing algorithm, and you get all your hashes created from those dictionary words, then obviously you then know, don't you? You can see the correlation between the word and the hash, and you know it. And there's reams of rainbow. There's enormous billions of sized entries, billions of entries in rainbow tables where these mappings have been done by people who've stolen passwords online, or just your general black hat a-holes that put together huge hashing tables. So you want to try to avoid being part of those, and that's where salting comes into play. And salting is where an extra element of randomness is added to the calculation that creates the hash. So hashing's great, but only when it's salted. It would be my point on that. So make your password strong, have it hashed, have it salted, and that's the best yet. But of course, you don't get a choice in that. You're at the whim of whoever it is that's put in place security for the application or system that you're trying to use. It's with much regret, actually, that I have to confirm that the majority of banks don't hash passwords, don't hash and salt passwords. They use reversible encryption, and that. And this is a case of functionality over security. And we know this because if you phone the bank up, sometimes they will say to you, what's the third, eighth, and 12th character of your password, or maybe you have an app and the app says what's the third, fifth and seventh character of your password. Now, how do they know? If it had been hashed, salted and hashed, or even just hashed, it would not be able to pull that back. It could not, from that hash, work out what your second, third, fourth, or any of the characters of your password are. The fact that it can do that means they haven't been salted and hashed, which means that your password is going to spend more time in clear text than it needs to while authentication is being processed. So the way this started, I think, was because some people on that are listening might remember a time before mobile banking and web app banking. We had a thing called telephone banking. It's still around, actually, of course, but telephone banking was the new big thing in the late 80s, early 90s. And they would ask you then, what's your third, fifth, and sixth character? And the idea was that you didn't have to say your password out loud through the phone in case somebody heard it, right? So that was, and it made sense in that context. But when you come to the context of entering 3 characters of your password into your banking app, let's say you're doing it with a web app, well, it's just a pain in the, for two things. A, it's a pain because if you have a nice long password as you've been recommended, and then you pick you're asked for the 7th, 12th, and 15th character, that's actually not that easy to do. You ever done that?
Every time.
And then you get it wrong, right? So then you think, and I have done this, I'll level with you, I've done this, where I've written the password out and literally had to count the letters. I even numbered the letters once so that I could quickly do it. And then hopefully you can see that you've just introduced an insecurity because you've made people write it down to try to work out what the letters are. In addition to that, you've also reduced the security substantially by meaning now, from a brute force guessing point of view, they only need 3 characters rather than the 20 odd that your password is made up of. So you've actually made it more difficult to do and less secure simultaneously. But that's an interesting one, because it's stuck around and it's stayed there because it's something people have become comfortable with from telephone banking. But it needs to end. And I'm gonna tip my cap here because the person that first brought that to my attention was probably about at least 10 years ago, maybe more like 15, and that was Mark Goodwin at a talk that he did for us in University of Derby. So I credit him with that all those years ago. But it's a very good point how the banking industry seemed to be quite backwards in that regard.
Okay, so we've covered confidentiality and integrity. So the third and final, availability of what?
Well, the systems, to make sure that they're still functional. I mean, Brad, as well as I do in the industry that we're working in, that's one of the primary concerns, along with integrity, is that the business can keep operational. And if you take a business's email down, or its ability to take payments down, or its CRM system, the human resources, whatever it might be, if that's taken away, often it can bring a company to a grinding halt. So the other part of cybersecurity is making sure those systems remain available, and we're talking here about ensuring that they're robust, against hackers, against faults, drives failing, servers failing, systems failing, internet going down, whatever it might be, natural disasters, flood, fire, whatever, against theft as well. The availability one's quite an easy concept to grasp, right? It's easier to see than the other two, but the importance there is huge as well, particularly when we consider ransomware. Okay, ransomware probably being the biggest threat to availability. But the thing about ransomware is it buggers up everything, right? Because you lose the availability, but also you haven't got access to the data anymore. So systems are down and people's data is no longer there. And so I'd say ransomware is probably the biggest threat to availability. And that's why we have the importance of backups, that ability to roll back to previous data. I mean, really, really, really quality backups is ransomware's nemesis. because you can't be guaranteed that you're not going to get hit by ransomware. There's too many infection methods that can happen. Obviously, you want to reduce how often it happens. It would be better if it only hit once every 10 years rather than three times a year, right? So you want to reduce the amount of times it happens and reduce the, more importantly, reduce the impact when it happens. And obviously, detection's a great way. If you detection and prevention, definitely. But if it hits and it gets in, then backups are your way of dealing with that. Of course, we have some fantastic methods of backup now, particularly in the cloud, with the ability to pull back from images. So yeah, that's availability.
So what can we do to ensure that cybersecurity, just in general, is being adhered to and prioritized in businesses?
Then within the organizations from a cybersecurity perspective at least can be categorized as being composed of people, processes, and technology. And I'm gonna go through talk about those in that order actually, because I think it makes sense. So the first thing is, we've talked about CIA, we've talked about cybersecurity, but none of it's going to work at all unless we get people's buy-in, unless people take it seriously. So if you start in an organization as a cybersecurity consultant, then I think one of your biggest challenges is going to be selling the necessity to do something about the threat and being persuasive enough that the people within the organization recognize the scale of the threat. And I work with, a number of CIOs and IT managers, and I try to help them with this. And we're all in the same position of having great difficulty in persuading people what the problems are and how big the problem is. Especially being, a lot of the times you can be breached without even knowing. Your data is being stolen and sold, and competitors are getting advantages, and threats are coming from abroad, and you think to yourself, why aren't I winning this business, or why isn't the company so profitable? And you never know, right? The fact that it isn't because somebody else is using your intellectual property and data, and they've got the march on you. You know, you don't always find out, right? Not all malware is ransomware. Not all malware is trying to extort money from you. Sometimes they don't want you to know they're in. They want to stay in there for as long as possible and glean as much information as they can. And it's getting those kind of messages through to corporations who quite often will just say, "Well, we've never had a breach, and I don't know anybody that's ever had a breach." And they genuinely believe that, right? That they have never been breached, and nobody they've ever known has been breached. And I would argue that they have been breached almost certainly if there were any kind of organization, at least in some way, means or form, they have been, and it would have been detrimental to their business, and they just don't know about it. We see evidence of it all the time. When we go and do pen tests, quite often we just stumble across evidence that somebody's been in there maliciously, and we tell them, and they're like, "Didn't know." Okay, now. Let's deal with it. That ability to persuade and get buy-in from the others that you need to do something about it is absolutely crucial. There's no panacea here. There's no silver bullet. I don't have a way of making that happen other than supplying people with the facts. I think sometimes if you tell people they're wrong, it is a really big problem. I don't think. Let's say, right, you're having this discussion, and somebody says, "I don't think it's a problem," right? I don't know. Let's say you're your chief operating officer or whatever, or your MD says, I don't think there's a problem because we haven't seen any evidence of any breaches, and it just gives you a whole bunch of reasons why it doesn't think it's a problem. Which you would get a lot, by the way. I don't always think it's the right approach to say no, you're wrong, because once you tell somebody they're wrong or they're misinformed, the usual reaction is defensiveness, digging their heels in, confirmation bias, looking up information online that supports their argument and ignoring all other information. This happens a lot, right? A better approach is just to talk about incidents that have happened with other people. I saw this the other day and I was really worried about it with this organization. and talk through it. Or this is quite a shocker. Have you seen what's happened to so and so? A competitor, say, maybe, or do a demonstration to show how easy it could be. Provide facts and statistics and knowledge, and then what your hope should be is that the MD or whoever's the person that's necessary for supplying budget for your cybersecurity says to you, I've been thinking about it. I think we need to put something in place here. I'm concerned about these threats. And you then say, what a great idea. Yeah, I've been thinking the same myself. I'm really pleased you brought it up. And then you'll find that relationship will work a lot better. But that's an art to do that, right? But I think if you're a cybersecurity professional, cybersecurity costs money and you don't necessarily see the benefits of it. So, and there is many. It's not just about preventing the risk, but it's also about enabling the business to allow you to go into new areas with less risk and embrace new technologies with less risk. So these are the kind of things that you're going to need to do, I think, as a cybersecurity person. You need to get buy-in from the C-suite, from managers, but actually, ultimately, everybody. Because once you've got your buy-in from your managers and your C-suite, and you start putting these things into place, everybody needs to adhere by the rules, because everybody's got access to email. Everybody's got access to data. Almost everybody within an organization has access to data that's private and confidential and personally identifying. So that security awareness needs to be broad and deep, and everybody needs to be aware of it. So it's getting buy-in from everybody in the company, and the best way to do that is through their managers. So you start with the C-suite. The C-suite put budget your way. Great. Now you can start doing something about it. You talk to the managers. You get them. You use the same persuasive methods that we talked about before with the managers, and get them to understand the scale of the problem, and they will hopefully push that through to the people on their team. Make them realize what the consequences might be of not doing, and get everybody's buy-in. And that obviously there's a lot of training that's involved in that, both professional training to make sure that people have the right technical skills, but also that the user awareness training as well. So that's the people side of it, I think, and probably the most important side, because the rest of it, you haven't got the people side sorted. The process and the technology stuff isn't going to get done because nobody believes in the cause. So the people, you've got to start with the people. You've got to get buy-in from the people. Nothing happens without the people in charge wanting to make it happen. And that can be very difficult, but it's extremely important.
Yeah, so people are, one of the most important aspects to securing an organization from a cyber perspective. But the two other pillars, process and technology. Talk to me about process.
We need to ensure that there is some accountability and some understanding of what everybody's responsibilities are in terms of ensuring that the organization remains secure. That cultural, ethos of treating people's data with care and ensuring that they're taking the appropriate action to prevent mishaps with data. So I think this can be broken up again into to three further sections, if you like: activities, roles, and documentation within process. When I'm talking about activities, I'm talking about the governance of data, the management of data, auditing data so everybody knows where it is, how it's stored, how it's transferred, how it's looked after, and then best practice. And you know what? I could talk about best practice all day in terms of the best practice in terms of using email and encryption and the storage and movement of data. But they need to be known and understood what the best practice is for the processing of data and the handling of data, and then that information needs to be made clear to everybody. And it needs to be built into their job description, right? So into the role that they have at the organization, their responsibilities need to be highlighted, as you do whenever somebody starts. You give them a job description, right? And you have a conversation with them and say, this is what you're going to be responsible for. It's very important that part of that is going to be cybersecurity and privacy and all the sensible stuff that needs to happen. And that, of course, can tie into the training part that we discussed in people. And when people start, they can go on some training in terms of user awareness and security, cybersecurity training, just how to manage data in a secure way, how to spot phishing emails, and so forth. And then we have the documentation side, which supports that part of it in terms of having this information recorded and written down. So it can be loosely broken down into three sections: documentation, which is policies, processes, documented processes, and documented procedures. And the policies is the higher level, if you like. So it's a sort of there's a one-to-many relationship between policies and processes, and a one-to-many relationship between processes and procedures. So you can have a number of processes that need to be documented for a particular policy. So the policy is the high-level document, if you like. Right? It offers guidance and advice, and talks about best practice, and it's written in a way that can be understood by anybody, regardless of technical knowledge and understanding. It's they're designed to sit at a higher level, if you like, and they should be made accessible to everybody, and they should be read by everybody, and they should be understood by everybody within the company, and everybody, and they should be, people should be made to read the cybersecurity policies and then prove that they've read the cybersecurity policies. You can have a system where people just tick off to say, yes, I've read it, and you can force them to go to the end of the document and tick a box. And we've seen those things. We see them regularly, don't we, on the internet? But I actually think a better way to do it is to then have a little quiz at the end. And if they fail the quiz, they can't move on. They've got to pass the quiz. Just makes them make a bit more effort. And that's something I think that should be done every year, because policies change and they get updated, and we need to make sure that people are staying on top of the cybersecurity policies. So there's that side of things. And then we have a more granular level of processes. And here we're moving to documentation that talks about how you would do those things. So we talk about best practice and guidance in policies. The processes can actually talk about how that's done. And it may be with processes that not everybody needs to read all the processes documentation. You just need to read the documentation that's relevant to you. So I'd say everybody needs to read the policies, regardless of what your role is. But perhaps the processes, you only need to read that if those processes apply to your sort of day-to-day role. And then we have more granular yet still with procedures. And when we reach the point of procedures, we're at a step-by-step level. Do A, then do B, then do C, then do E, to guide you through it. And obviously they're particularly useful for people who are maybe new to a role, so that they can see how to go by this step by step. So that documentation is essential to support, so everybody understands what the processes are and how to secure them. And the documentation is there to support the people. They're the three pillars, if you like, of cybersecurity within an organization. So we've had your three pillars of cybersecurity: your confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And then to make that work within the organization, that can be broken down into people, processes, and technology. So we've talked about the people and the processes, but the technology really, I don't like it when people put the technology first, when cybersecurity is driven by the technology rather than the people and the processes. Technology should be supportive of the things that you're trying to achieve. And what goes wrong, I think, sometimes is that, obviously vendors are pushing very hard to sell their product, whether it be an endpoint security system or some next-gen firewall or a SIM system or, a DLP software solution or, whatever it might be, right? Or vendors are all pushing and vying with each other, and they know that people have a limited cybersecurity budget, so they're thinking, well, we spend it with us, right? We'll make you secure. Buy our fantastic gizmo, and it plugs into your network, and all your problems go away. Well, we know that's not true. Go with people, process first, and then think, what technology can we use to make that happen? To enable that to happen. And your risk assessment is obviously a very important part of this, and the the people, processes, and technology are always looked at in a risk assessment. When we do a risk assessment, we make those the mainstay, if you like, of our investigation, for want of a better word, because kind of is an investigation. And all the time in the background while you're considering these things, you're thinking effects on confidentiality, integrity, and availability as you work through the people, the processes, and the technology within the organizations. So that's a rough overview, if you like, of cybersecurity and its impact and how it should be addressed within an organization. We could drill a lot further into it, but I think we've had quite a lot of time on it already. But happy to answer any questions that anybody has, or if you want to make a note in the comments, I'm happy to respond to that, or send me an email, and I'll respond.
Yeah, getting some questions and answers would be great. We'll open that up on LinkedIn, and feel free to send them in. info@samurai-security.co.uk. We'll answer your questions next week.
Awesome. All right. Thanks very much for your time.
Take care.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
This podcast was brought to you by Samurai Digital Security, purveyors of cybersecurity solutions. Find us at samurai-security.co.uk and follow us on LinkedIn, Twitter and Facebook. Samurai Security, tearing cybersecurity a new R since 2015.